Thank you very much. I'm Matthew Fitzmaurice. And this is my second opportunity to talk about divestment. How many of you have a view around divestment? So sort of 2/3 have a view. It might be useful for me to give you a little bit of background about who we are and where we came from, because I think in some respects the way we think about the world is the tree from which you fell sometimes defines who you are and where you go. My partners and I, have been in the asset management business running hedged absolute return strategies, which is really nothing more complicated than buying companies that we think their fundamentals are improving and the stocks are going to go up, and short companies who we think their fundamentals are deteriorating and the stocks are going to go down. So pretty simple, straightforward stuff. And about 7 years ago, a bank came to us, my partners in Melbourne, Australia, and said, would you look at all things water related and determine whether or not we could make money from that? And we said, yeah, but we don't know anything about that. And they said, yeah, but you understand how to ask the next most appropriate question, and in the financial world that may be useful to this discourse. So we engaged on a journey, if you will, where we started from the absolute return hedged world and got drawn into the sustainable, green, clean, Al Gore, socially responsible, impact investing world. And when I say that we knew nothing about it at the time, I mean we literally knew nothing about it at the time. But when we engaged in the process, we were engaging with a singular view to, is this an area where one could make money investing? And what we came out after a year's time was we determined that there was something really fascinating going on, and then there were some side stories. The fascinating part of the story was we thought that we were about to embark on a multi-decade opportunity where there would be a massive reallocation of capital driven by corporations who had concluded that it was in their economic self-interest to start to solve for problems born of these large drivers, these global drivers. So population growth, changing demographics, higher protein diets, were all creating burdens on water, ag, and energy. And in the end, we thought that the corporations would look up and say, either because of the vagaries of price or the inability to gain access to the resource at all, they were going to change their businesses and or spend to change their businesses to become more efficient around these resources. So once we had concluded that, it moved us squarely back away from the area of policy, advocacy, philanthropy, morality, etc., back into an area that we thought we had some acumen, which was economics and financial markets. Because what we thought would play out was this massive reallocation of capital. So that's the framework from which we became involved in this area. And it was only a matter of time, in our view, before we got to this inflection point, and we've now hit the inflection point, which was folks were going to stand up en masse and say, we need change. And McKibben and 350.org have essentially catalyzed that. And so with that, let me give you some insights, because I think that we've got a particularly useful background and two vantage points. We do understand the institutional asset owners' mentality, because they are the folks that invest with us. That's on the one hand. And yet on the other hand, we think that there's something really interesting going on in this sustainable investing space, and it's driven by economics and economic self-interest, along with policy advocacy, philanthropy, etc. But we have been able to sort of disaggregate it and get it down and reduce it to its simplest form of economics and economic self-interest. And we think there's something really powerful in that. And so with that, I'd like to think that in the end, I might leave you with a construct to think about how to achieve goals that might be economic in their underpinning as opposed to policy advocacy, philanthropy, and maybe I'll be booed out of the room, but also perhaps histrionics, because there's plenty of that to go around as well. So with that, my view is divestment is an extraordinary, well, I should state it this way. The divestment movement has been an extraordinarily successful call to arms or call to action. I will get into in a minute that I don't think it will be successful in and of itself. In other words, I don't believe that institutions will divest. Or if they do divest, they won't divest because we've asked them to divest. They will divest because it's in their economic self-interest, and we'll get into that in a second. On the other hand, sustainable investing is a massive catalyst for change, and we'll talk about that in a minute as well. So let's set the stage. I happen to believe climate change exists. Believe me, there are plenty of folks that don't. I walk into meetings and I get to say this, and I'm going to say it at the front end, and I get to say it again later, maybe. I'm a 52-year-old white male. When I walk into meetings with institutional investors, there's usually 8 people at a table, 6 or 7 of which are white males over the age of 50. When you walk into the room, excluding sort of in the last year or two, and use the word climate change, sustainable, Al Gore, etc., 6 out of the 7 white males over the age of 50 hair burst into flames because they have these very clear views about what it is you're talking about, which probably has absolutely nothing to do with what you're talking about. So I happen to be a believer that climate change exists. Here are the facts. You know, it's according to us, you know, according to what we believe, you know, warming's happening faster than ever. Humans are responsible. There's and what I want to walk you through is because language matters, we've got to set the context for what is divestment about and what are we trying to achieve. And in the end, divestment is essentially saying climate change is happening, there are very real consequences, and we need to do something about it, and divestment's the best way to do that, or one of the ways to do that. So let's make sure that we understand what we're talking about. Greenhouse gases are trapped, the planet temperature increases. So that's what happens. What's the effect? You get flooding, heat waves, droughts, fires, storms, ancillary, and you know, the list goes on and on and on. And I mean, these are very real issues. So we're not talking about something that's abstract and obtuse. These are you know, problems. Pete, right? What do you do for a living? Plant pathology. Spreading of plant and animal human diseases across borders. Climate change. This is happening. Pete will tell you about it afterwards. The stability of government structures changing rapidly. The Arab Spring is literally born of this. Disruption of storm tracks. The Corn Belt's moving north, displacing, you know, canola at a rate that we've never seen before. You know, very real consequences. By the way, as the Corn Belt moves north, you know, they don't have enough transportation to be able to solve for these issues as they have larger crops up there. So, you know, very real consequences. Rising sea levels, you know, submerging infrastructure, you know, 60 billion in damages from Hurricane Sandy. Here is the challenge. So if we got a problem, you know, what is the exact problem? Well, as 350 defines it, and others, it's, you know, sort of safe at 350 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. I think we're currently at 390. They say, listen, we're never going to stop this in its tracks. It's heading towards some bigger number. If we can stop it at 450, we've got a reasonable chance of the following not happening. We can't have 2 more degrees of rise in global temperatures, or else we've got, sort of a snowballing effect of human catastrophe. So that's the construct. And so how are we going to get this to stop from happening? Well, there are contributors to CO2 being put in the air, and fossil fuel companies are one of the largest contributors, and then obviously everything in that supply chain. Therein lies the argument that we ought to, and there's a number of things that we can do. We can have policy, philanthropy. I put divestment under advocacy. Some of you may think that it more appropriately goes under economics because you believe that if you can get folks to divest, it will have an economic consequence. I would say that that's not accurate. I don't think it will have an economic impact. They're still debating apartheid. Obviously, I know what the result was, but they're still debating whether or not it was causal. Here, I think it's even more challenging because you've got public market securities, you sell them and there's an active buyer, and it sort of goes on and on and on. So I view divestment up in the advocacy piece. There are folks in the room that might disagree with me that are part of the divestment movement. And then ultimately there are economics. We have a general view. There is no amount of policy, philanthropy, and advocacy that can change these problems. They don't aggregate to be big enough and powerful enough to change what we need to do. So, oops, that was my pointer, and it didn't even point. Here are some thoughts around policy and why I think it's limited. The CAFE standards have been terrific, but it's a little, it comes after a massive brawl, and it goes on and on and on, and we still don't get to the point where Europe is. And so it's mildly successful, and yes, we're moving in the right direction, but more often than not, it's gridlock, it's political differences, it's giant, screaming at each other, it's keystone, we don't advance the ball. Philanthropy. So to give you some context, we need trillions of dollars spent to start to solve for these issues. This is interesting. So if you look at water, I don't think people understand this. The infrastructure spend on water in the 2020 to 2030 timeframe will be $1 trillion. It dwarfs anything that's going to go on in electricity, railroad, and road and rail. So in just one of the areas where we've got massive issues, we need trillions of dollars. So what about divestment? My personal view, divestment has been exceedingly successful as a call to arms. The discourse that has started on universities, the discourse that has started at public pension plans, the discourse that has started at state municipalities has been nothing short of extraordinary. If you'd asked me 12 months ago, and I was looking at this 12 months ago, I'd have said, it'll die a quiet death. He won't gain traction. It has been extraordinary. Successes, some, in terms of actual divestment, but this is the stuff that matters, the discourse. So you now, barely a week can go by without some major publication writing something on these topics. And then you've got to also think about this ancillary effect or the wave. They're having the conversation at Harvard, and Harvard's stiff-arming folks. But it doesn't mean that the conversation isn't continuing to boil. I was a graduate at Georgetown, undergraduate in Georgetown Law School. I've had conversations with the CIO at Jack DeGioia, the president's suggestion. I have a conversation with the CIO, and it's mind-numbing how how quickly he's able to stiff-arm me. And yet the discourse now at the university has been turned up enough so that Jack's calling me and saying, hey, would you be willing to come and have a conversation with us about this as we figure out where we're going to plot this course? So that's a huge difference from even 12 months ago. So as a call to arms or a call to action, I think it's been extraordinarily successful. Why is it not enough? Well, I've touched on this. The people with whom you're trying to have the conversation are typically 50-year-old white males. They think they're smart. They think they're pretty good at what they do. You don't speak their language. Their language is about superior risk-adjusted returns. So when you walk in the room and say, let's divest, they immediately say, everything I've been trained says there's an investment pool, the world in which I can invest, and if I limit that pool, by definition, I'm going to limit my return possibility. So that's the first one. They run up the flagpole. Meanwhile, they're thinking to themselves, you know, I'm smarter than these folks are anyway. In my job, I get paid by putting a smile on my boss's face, and my boss is looking for me to generate a superior risk-adjusted return. So if you're going to monkey with my superior risk-adjusted return, I don't want to know anything about this. And so I think from the very get-go, because performance is king and you're talking a different language, the conversation around divestment is very, very difficult. Then they're going to run up the flagpole this idea that if I don't own the shares, I actually can't advocate to bring about change. I mean, really? Okay. I mean, but that's the argument they run up the flagpole. And then the final one they run up the flagpole is they said, listen, you know, if you think about this, I think this is tremendous. So the two most important folks at universities, other than perhaps the president, are the big-time athletic coach and the CIO. And the reason is they are the only profit makers. They stand around and generate revenues to these organizations. And this is largely true of, you know, other places other than simply endowments. And so when you walk in the door and you start to touch their profit machine with advocacy, philanthropy, and political conversations, you know, they just, I mean, you know, their head starts to spin around on its, you know, on their shoulders. So for these reasons, I think that divestment is going to be a very difficult opportunity. But I get back to this notion of language. If you walk in the door and you say, now that I've engaged you, I've hit you over the head and you've been forced to have this conversation with me, let's talk about what the roadmap is. Do you agree that we've got a problem? I know Doug Gorence would say, yeah, we got a problem. So, Doug, I'm not asking you to divest. What's the roadmap for us bringing to bear our capital in a way that's going to be more effective at reaching some of these goals? So he's going to say, geez, I don't know, why don't you put it back in my court and I'll come back with you with a roadmap about how we're going to do that. Because now you put the power back into his chair. He thinks he's smarter. I don't know that Doug thinks he's smarter than everybody else, but the generic CIO thinks they're smarter than everybody else. And so you give them the power back to go, and then you start to have the discussion with them about, is the roadmap focused enough? Is it impactful enough? Is it quick enough? But you've allowed them to take ownership of the investment roadmap as opposed to saying divest, which for all these other reasons, you know, in my view, probably doesn't work. So what is sustainable investing, or what are you asking them to do? There are sort of 4 ways to sustainably invest. Socially responsible investing is the oldest. That's essentially started by religious organizations. You know, no guns, no porno, no alcohol, no tobacco, no bombs. They limited their investment world, and typically institutional investors believe that social responsible investing narrows your opportunity set and therefore generates a crappy return. And in point of fact, there's a reasonable amount of data that says that either that's why, or the people that were practicing weren't very good at it, because the returns have been reasonably poorer. They have not excelled. ESG is the outgrowth of socially responsible investing. It's essentially saying, let's go look at the universe of companies. Let's look at them from a financial perspective, but let's also look at them from one other perspective. Would E, environmental, S, social, G, governance issues, characteristics, would they give us a proxy or an insight into whether or not a company is going to perform? So if you have a board of directors and there's 8 people on it, 2 of them are women and 2 of them are people of color, do we think that in the end that is going to be a place that's more diverse, is going to have better sort of policies that are infused throughout the whole organization, and therefore higher productivity, which is going to allow us to have better margins, higher revenues, and therefore greater earnings? Or if you take it back into our realm, E for environmental, if I'm a company paying attention to my water usage, does that mean I'm also paying attention to my other inputs and outputs, and therefore my expense structure, and also my reputational risks, and so therefore am I somebody or am I a company that's going to have better results across the board? My personal view on ESG is ESG will essentially be incorporated and infused into every investment decision over the next 10 years, period. It would be like asking an investment manager, do you use valuation to make an assessment of whether or not you're going to buy a security? And you know, if you asked an investment manager, they'd look at you like you had 4 heads. Of course I think about valuation. To not be thinking about environmental, social, and governance issues, I suspect in 5 years would be like asking them whether or not they think about. And if that proves to be true, then ESG investing will not be a way to distinguish yourself or advance the ball. It'll be just sort of part of everything else. Environmental investing has been something that's been around for 10 years. It is sort of what it says it is, which is there was a movement 10 years, 12 years, 15 years ago to look at output-related, pollution-related, garbage-related, you know, issues and invest in ways that allowed that to become, did I do that? To be more efficient around that. The problem with that is I'm going to make an argument when I get to solutions investing that when you invest, you need to be doing it from an economic self-interest. And the problem with environmental investing is there's no price on carbon and hasn't been. And so therefore, it's not in anybody's economic self-interest to go solve for these issues that are output-focused yet. I think it's coming, and I think it's coming quicker than everybody believes. Solutions investing is pretty straightforward. Go to where the economic self-interest of corporations, governments, and consumers drives them to change their behavior because it's in their economic self-interest. So what do I mean by that? Economic self-interest. So let me give you 2 examples before we deal with this chart. No looking. I'm going to turn back because I know you're all reading the chart. 2 examples of economic self-interest, 2 kinds. I've already referenced them, but I'm going to give you examples. So Coca-Cola builds a $1 billion plant in India and 4 years later runs out of water. Now, Coke doesn't get busy solving for their water problem because somebody's telling them to. They don't get busy because they think it's going to be better for the community. They get busy because it's in their economic self-interest to solve for this problem. Now, there may be some folks in the room that go, boo-hoo, that's cruddy. But I'm sort of a pragmatist, and I'd actually like to win the win and solve for the problem as opposed to, sort of point fingers. So if I can figure out a way where it's win-win, Coke becomes a lot more conscious around water issues because it's in their economic self-interest, and simultaneously it is a benefit to folks in the community because you can't solve. There's a great CDP, Carbon Disclosure Project, great CDP, what is it, water piece that's out. It's out in the last 4 days. Everybody ought to read it. They've branched out and they're talking about how most of the focus around water has been, sort of narrowly, and it ought to be more broadly considered. Coke actually does a pretty good job of not only worrying about it from a business perspective, but from the larger community perspective, which is the way this stuff has to be done. So that's economic burdens that you solve for because you don't have access to the resource. The other one is what I refer to as vagaries of price. 60% of Nike's soft goods used to be cotton-based. 6 years ago, I think this was. There was a drought in the Southeast, and cotton prices are up by 40%. Phil Knight doesn't come in that morning and go, gee whiz, climate change created this problem. He walks in the morning and says, 60% of my soft good inputs are cotton, and cotton's up by 40%. That's a problem. We need to solve for this. So in their infinite wisdom, because they're the ones that were had the kids sewing the ball in Bangladesh. You'd think they'd have learned after that little experience. They switched to a synthetic that was petroleum-based. And over the next 14 months, petroleum was up 60 or 80%. So finally, Phil got religion and said, okay, we're done with this. This is 3 strikes. We're going to hire somebody whose sole job it is to think about these issues from a business perspective, but is trained to be thinking about them as sustainable issues. And so they hired a woman whose name just escaped me. I had it a second ago, who literally sits up in a triumvirate. She's called the sustainability czar or whatever she's called at the organization, but she's not about putting, bright and colorful and useful facts on websites. She's about driving the business of the business in a way that is sustainable and not subject to the vagaries of price or subject to the inability to gain access to these kinds of resources. So let's go into the lion's den. This is Exxon. Exxon says that we're using 500 quadrillion BTUs of energy right now to satisfy the world's energy demands. They say that over the next 30 years, by 2040, we're going to need 700 quadrillion additional BTUs, 500 million of which are going to come from efficiency. Wow, did Exxon just say that? They actually did. So that number, 500 quadrillion BTUs, is $9 trillion that would have got spent on fossil fuels that's going to be reallocated. That spend is going to be spent on something else. That's an amazing, unbelievably powerful fact. And so what that says, if you're somebody who's in my position, is, wow, I better figure out how to get in front of that massive spend cycle, because the stuff they used to be spending on, they're not going to be spending on anymore. And so I want to get in front of the stuff they're going to be spending on. And secondarily, I better get out of the way of that stuff they're not going to be spending on. And so my personal view is divestment because we're telling them that they're ruining the universe? I don't know. How about divestment because they're saying out loud that we're not going to spend money on this stuff anymore because it's in our economic self-interest to not spend money on it? You think that folks are happy when Hurricane Sandy knocked out their power for 3 months? Distributed solar, bam, everybody was up and running. The price of solar used to be $5 a panel. That was 5 years ago. It's 50 cents a panel right now. 3/4 of the human race lives in areas where at 50 cents a panel, without subsidies, solar is competitive with the electricity currently being delivered. Really? Really? Elasticity of demand, whoosh. These public electric utility companies are going out of business. Go on the internet and look up E.ON or RWE and read anything their CEOs have said. These are the 2 largest German public electric utilities. Their stocks are down 40% over the last 10 quarters. They're not down because somebody stood up and said we need to divest. They're down because folks are starting to figure out that their business models are fundamentally flawed because they are predicated on peak demand pricing, 24 hours in a day, 22 of which you charge $1. For the 2 hours that you don't charge $1, you charge $1,000. Great, unless 50% of your peak energy demands are being satisfied by solar, which is the case in Germany. That literally tips over their business model. And the same thing's happening here in the US as we speak. So, in my view, when you walk into Doug Gorence's office and say, we've got this CO2 problem and it's a giant problem and here's what it's doing, let's divest. How about let's invest with an eye towards sustainable investing because it's already happening. It's happening in your portfolio as we speak. And all we need to do is make a whole bunch more capital, get there in a hurry, because as it sloshes in that direction, it amplifies. And what happens is as the capital moves towards sustainable investing in front of the wave that's already started, it becomes, self-perpetuating. The cost of capital for the companies that are providing the solutions goes down. The cost of capital for the companies Eon down 40%, RWE down 40%, their cost of capital goes up. And so they get in what's called a death spiral. And so if you go read these articles, you can't believe the stuff these CEOs are saying. These are guys running $60 billion market cap and $30 billion market cap companies, and they're saying, we're fighting for our economic life. I don't know. Guys, last time I checked, you flew around on jumbo jets, private airplanes. You're a regulated business that allowed you to increase prices 6% every year, whether you needed to or not. And now you're whining because solar's coming in and it's an economic alternative to what you do for a living. Why don't you get busy and compete and drag yourself into the 20th century or go out of business? I'm okay with either. Is that it? Or did I? Nope. But what did I do? What did I do? How do I turn it back on? It's actually not it. It's maybe one slide away from being it. Oh, God, solar's been a mess. Now, to be fair, solar, went like this and went like this over the last 3 years. But if anybody's confused about what's going on in solar, here's the market capitalization of a bunch of solar companies. It's up 100% in the last 12 months, and it's up 100% for a reason. Pricing's gone $5 to 50 cents. Costs have gone down, Moore's Law, and they've taken pricing down so that the costs now are 50 cents, and they're selling it now at 68 cents, and margins have gone from minus 15 to plus 15, and companies have been reporting all week, massive earnings surprises. And people early on are figuring it out. And so when you go to Doug Gorence, you say, Doug, listen, I don't know, it's already happening. Man, why aren't you there? Start getting some money into the kinds of things where there's going to be winners and losers, where investment managers are bringing to bear their investment acumen with an eye towards where's the massive reallocation of capital that's already started. Because in the end, we're creating winners and losers, and the winners are going to be the folks, whether it's here or electric vehicles or LED or smarter pumps and pipes in the water space, or I don't know, Pete, smarter seeds that are drought resistant. I think that is it. I don't know. If it's not, I just turned it off again. So with that, I'm happy to take some questions. Does anybody have any questions, or should we go eat?